Walk through any old farm town in New England or the Midwest and look up. On top of half the barns and a good number of the farmhouses, there's a strange little box sitting right at the peak of the roof, usually with slanted wooden slats or a row of tiny windows, sometimes topped with a weather vane. Most people who drive past one assume it's just an old decoration, something to make the roofline look nice. It isn't. That box was doing a job. For almost 200 years, it was the only air conditioner most American buildings ever had. And it worked without a single moving part, a single watt of electricity, or a single dollar in monthly utility bills. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, builders started leaving it off. Today, if you buy a new home almost anywhere in the country, that box simply doesn't exist. So what exactly did we throw away, and how much cooling did it actually take with it? That box is called a cupola, and stretched out longer along the whole spine of a roof, the same design is called a monitor roof. And before we get into why it disappeared, we need to understand what it was actually doing up there, because the physics behind it is almost embarrassingly simple, and that's exactly why it worked so well for so long. Every building, no matter how it's built, has warm air sitting near its ceiling. Heat rises because warm air is less dense than cool air, and it will keep rising until it finds somewhere to go. In a modern, sealed-up house that somewhere is nowhere, the heat just piles up against the underside of the roof and stays there, cooking the rooms below it all afternoon and into the evening. But if you give that rising air an exit at the very highest point of the building, something interesting happens. As the hot air escapes through the top, it doesn't just vent itself. It starts pulling in a steady stream of replacement air from the coolest, lowest openings in the building, usually a basement window, a shaded doorway, or a vent along the foundation. That upward pull, driven by nothing but the temperature difference between the air near the ceiling and the air outside, is called the stack effect, and a cupola is simply a chimney built for air instead of smoke. The genius of the design is that it's entirely self-regulating. On a mild spring day, the temperature difference between the peak of the roof and the outside air is small, so the draw through the cupola is gentle. But on the worst, most brutal afternoon of July, when the air trapped near the ceiling is at its hottest, the temperature gap between that trapped air and the cooler air being pulled in from below is at its largest. And that gap is exactly what drives the airflow, so the hotter it gets outside, the harder the system works to cool itself. No thermostat, no fan, no switch, just heat pulling on heat. Farmers understood this instinctively long before anyone wrote the physics down. In dairy barns and hay barns across the country, a cupola wasn't primarily about comfort. It was about survival for the building itself. Freshly stored hay still holds a small amount of moisture, and as it sits in a packed barn loft, that moisture keeps releasing into the air around it. Trapped in an unventilated space, that damp, warm air is a recipe for mold, rot, and in bad enough cases, spontaneous combustion inside the hay itself. A cupola turned the barn into a giant one-way exhaust system, pulling that damp air out through the roof before it could do any damage, which is exactly why you'll still see them on barns built well over a century ago, quietly doing the same job they always did. Homes used the same trick for people instead of hay. George Washington's Mount Vernon has an 8-sided cupola sitting on top of the main house, and it wasn't put there for architectural flair. It was drawing hot air up out of the living spaces below on humid Virginia summers long before anyone in America had heard of mechanical air conditioning. Public buildings did the same thing at a larger scale. Faneuil Hall in Boston has had a cupola venting its marketplace since the 1740s, moving air through a building packed with bodies and no electricity to help it. If you stretch that same cupola shape out along the entire length of a roof instead of a single box, you get what builders call a monitor roof, a raised strip running down the ridge, usually with a row of windows or louvers on both sides, common on old mill buildings, gymnasiums, and train depots, where a huge open floor needed constant fresh air with nothing but the stack effect to move it. So if a cupola or a monitor roof could cool an entire building for free indefinitely with zero energy cost, why doesn't a single new subdivision in America have one? The honest answer isn't a conspiracy, it's a sequence of construction decisions that each made sense on their own and quietly added up to erasing the whole idea. The first is his roof framing. A traditional cupola sits on top of a roof structure built with individual rafters, which leaves an open, walkable attic space underneath that air can actually move through before it escapes. After the Second World War, American builders switched almost entirely to engineered roof trusses. Prefabricated triangular frames that go up faster, need less skilled labor, and use less lumber per square foot of roof. Trusses are excellent at holding a roof up. They're terrible at leaving open, ventable space for a cupola to work with, because the whole point of a truss is to fill that space with a dense web of diagonal supports. Once trusses became standard, cutting a working cupola into the roofline stopped being a simple carpentry job and became a structural modification most builders had no interest in pricing out. The second reason is the same one that ended a lot of passive cooling design in this country. Central air conditioning got cheap. Once a compressor and a duct system could cool a house regardless of how the roof was built, a feature whose entire value proposition was keeps the house cooler without power, stopped mattering to a builder trying to hit a price point. Air conditioning didn't just compete with the cupola, it made the cupola look unnecessary, even though the two aren't actually doing the same job. One cools by removing heat, the other cools by refrigerating air that heat keeps flowing back into. The third reason is leaks. Any opening in a roof is a place water can eventually find its way in, and a cupola has louvers, seams, and flashing points that need real maintenance over decades. A truss roof with a continuous ridge vent strip does a version of the same job, letting hot attic air escape at the peak, with far fewer seams, far less flashing, and a fraction of the long-term leak risk. Builders and roofing insurers both had every incentive to standardize on the boring, low-maintenance option once it existed. And the fourth reason is simply that architectural fashion moved on. Post-war suburban design shifted hard toward low, simple rooflines, ranch houses, split levels, flat-fronted colonials, where a raised box on the ridge looked old-fashioned rather than charming. A feature that used to signal a well-built farmhouse started reading as outdated the moment tract housing became the new normal. None of those four reasons have anything to do with whether the physics still works. They're reasons about labor costs, roof framing, insurance, and taste, not about whether pulling hot air out of a house for free is a good idea. So, does it still work today, and is it worth bringing back in some form? This is where we stop taking the history's word for it and look at what modern versions of the same idea actually do. You don't have to build a full farmhouse cupola to get the benefit of this principle. Almost every home built in the last 30 years already has a diluted version of it, and it's worth understanding how much weaker that version is. Standard ridge vents on modern roofs are a direct descendant of the cupola, using the exact same stack effect to pull hot air out of an attic through a continuous slot at the peak instead of a single box. They work, but only for the attic. They do nothing for the living space below it, because that attic is sealed off from the rooms by insulation and drywall on purpose. A working cupola on an old farmhouse, by contrast, was often open to the stairwell or the upper floor directly, so it was venting the house people actually lived in, not just the empty space above their ceiling. Whole house fans are the closest modern equivalent to what a cupola used to do for people, and they're a useful comparison because they make the same stack effect idea explicit and measurable. Mounted in the ceiling of the top floor, a whole house fan pulls warm indoor air up into the attic and pushes it out through the roof vents while pulling cooler evening air in through open windows below, mechanically doing on demand what a cupola did constantly and for free. Studies of whole house fan use in moderate climates have shown they can noticeably cut air conditioning runtime on evenings and mornings when outdoor air drops below indoor temperature. precisely the same window of time a passive cupola would have been working hardest just without a switch to turn it on. Put the two side by side, and the honest verdict is this: the cupola wasn't magic, and it wasn't going to replace air conditioning in the deep south in August. But in a huge stretch of the country with real day-to-night temperature swings, most of the Midwest, the Mountain West, the Northeast, it was quietly doing several hours a day of free cooling work that we now pay a compressor to do instead, and we didn't replace it with something better. We replaced it with cheaper roof framing and a monthly electric bill. That doesn't mean you need to bolt a Victorian cupola onto your roof this weekend. It means the underlying idea, giving hot air a real direct exit at the highest point of your house instead of trapping it in a sealed attic, is worth taking seriously again, especially if you're already planning any kind of roof or attic work. A properly sized whole house fan paired with a real ridge vent gets you most of what a cupola used to do at a fraction of the cost of framing a new one from scratch. And if you happen to already own an old house with a cupola still sitting up there, unused and painted shut for the last 40 years, that's not a decoration you're looking at. That's a working air conditioner your house has been sitting on top of the entire time. America didn't abandon the cupola because someone proved it didn't work. We abandoned it because trusses were cheaper to frame, air conditioning made it feel optional, and ranch houses made it look old-fashioned. The physics never stopped being true, it just stopped being profitable to build. If you want to see exactly how much a whole house fan can cut off a real cooling bill compared to running AC alone, that's the next test we're planning. Let us know in the comments if that's the one you want to see first, and if this is the kind of why did we stop doing the thing that worked story you're into. The cool roof breakdown we did last month is a good next watch.